Remembering a massacre China wants you to forget. It's been 30 years since civilians faced off against the Communist Party. How did those deadly demonstrations change a nation? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. June the 4th, 1989. You won't find that string of words anywhere on the internet in China. But that's not enough for a government determined to silence any commemoration of what happened that day. In recent weeks, dozens of activists have been detained. 4 were jailed for mentioning the anniversary on bottles of liquor. An 82-year-old mother whose son was killed during the demonstrations has been banished from Beijing, so she can't talk to foreign media. This crackdown is both history repeating itself and evidence of the direction China's government is going in. Amnesty International says President Xi Jinping has decimated the ranks of human rights lawyers and has overseen the ill treatment of protesters who are subject to arbitrary arrests, detentions, and torture. One of those still speaking out is Ma Jian, a dissident author who lives in exile. The newsmakers spoke to him, and Melinda Nucifora has this report.
It's one of the most recognisable images from a critical event in history. That is, unless you live in the country where it actually took place.
30年了，你会知道，一代人对这种历史的无知，它会感染到下一代人。我认为，中国人都是受害者。
As the world prepares to mark the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, in China, it's business as usual. No memorials, no laying of wreaths, no mention whatsoever of the day the Chinese military turned on its own people.
我认为这种在中国的这种审查，他们已经细到了每一个人的头脑里面。比如说，现在出版的学生字典。 自由的自，可以有这个，自己，自卫，但是没有自由。自由这个词在孩子头脑里边要消失，不存在了。
Chinese author Ma Jian lives in exile in London. He was in Tiananmen Square in the weeks leading up to the June 4 massacre of pro-democracy protesters.
你突然感到整个的这个北京的天安门广场。 像是一片非常自然的这个大自然的一片草原或者鲜花一样，但是你具体看，每一个人脸都带着理想，带着信心，甚至有些是带着微笑。我非常怀念中国人在那一瞬间，你会感觉到他们变得很亲切，很容易接近。他们都有一个共同的目标，希望把中国变得更加民主，人们活得有自己的尊严。 因为从毛泽东时代，中国人的尊严什么都没有。
Ma remembers those days vividly, but says the Chinese government is doing all it can to make its people forget. The largely student-driven protest started in April 1989. Hundreds of young people had gathered to mourn the death of pro-reform Communist Party chief Hu Xiaobang. For many Chinese, Hu was an aspirational symbol of hope and freedom, and before long his vigil evolved into a pro-democracy protest. For months, students and activists occupied the square in the middle of Beijing. At the peak of the protests, it's thought up to 1 million people rallied there against government oppression and corruption. By the start of June, the Communist Party had had enough. It declared martial law and sent in tanks and troops. The government says the use of force was necessary to control a public disturbance.
看就是明白是一件什么事，毫不含糊，就是要打倒共产党，打倒社会主义。
No official death toll from the crackdown has ever been released. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand.
但是现在的责任在是要你不要让你永远忘记60，不要提60。谁提60，谁就触犯了假犯，谁就触犯了惯犯，他就叫收审你，要给你安排颠覆国家罪。
It's still a very real fear, and not just for activists. Ahead of Tuesday's anniversary, Amnesty International has accused Chinese authorities of arresting or threatening the families of Tiananmen victims to stop them from speaking to the media.
我觉得这一件60惨案这个罪行，你是没有理由向自己的国民隐瞒的，应该是说。
But try as it might, Ma Jian says the government can't erase the desire for freedom.
30周年虽然是一个时代过去了结束了，下一代人没有办法去衔接上，但是这些历史它永远是活着的，它没有死掉，它不是活在这些图片里面，它也活在每个人的记忆里面。
Melinda Nusafora, The Newsmakers.
Well, before we begin our debate, let's first speak to photojournalist Jeff Widener. He's the man who took this remarkable photo of an unknown protester, later called Tank Man, during the Tiananmen Square protests. He joins us now from Honolulu. Jeff, good to have you on the Newsmakers. What was going through your mind when you took that photograph?
It was only about a few seconds after I realized that something had gone seriously wrong. And my shutter speed was way too slow. And by the time I figured it out, the man had been whisked away. And frankly, it was a miracle that picture came out.
What were your thoughts about the man and in the years after when we didn't really know what happened to him? Tell me your thoughts about him.
It was really an incredible feat what he did. But you got to understand that at the time, I was suffering from the flu. In fact, it's kind of comical because I'm suffering from a bit from the flu right now. But at the time, I was injured. I was hit in the face with a rock during a burning armored car incident. So when I was leaning over the balcony taking the photograph, it just, you know, at the time, I was just so scared. I really wasn't thinking too much about what was happening except getting that picture in focus.
Without that picture, what conversation would the world be having about Tiananmen now, 30 years later?
That's an interesting question. I'm really not sure what the topic and the tempo would be on that. I think you'd still have a lot of people every year in Hong Kong lighting candles. And I think that there would be less articles every anniversary time. I think the Tank Man just galvanizes the whole story and the situation very easily. I mean, no one knows who he is. He's like the unknown soldier, and the mystery grows, you know, as the years go by.
If you didn't have your camera with you and you had to report back in a sentence or two what you saw and what you experienced there in Tiananmen, what would that be?
Well, you know, one of the things that amazed me was when I first arrived, there was almost a carnival atmosphere at the Tiananmen Square with the students. There was this lightness, you know, this wonderful feeling in the air. Everyone was happy. It was well organized. You had students with mechanical printing presses. I was amazed that every morning I would arrive, they were building the Goddess of Democracy, which was basically a replica of the Statue of Liberty. And it was facing right across from the great Mao portrait, you know, which symbolizes communism. And I think a lot of the reporters got wrapped up in this whole thing, how amazing this is. Is it really possible that China could be converting to democracy? And I think that's what was going through my mind most of the time.
Right. In many ways, Jeff, it's almost impossible for protesters in China to organize to get to that level of protest in the squares these days because of social media and because of the government choking the internet and tools of communications and so on. So with that in mind, how would you compare the situation now in 2019 to 1989?
I don't think things are getting any better as far as freedom of press. I think that, you know, it really is up to the Chinese people to decide what they want in their country.
And talking about the symbolism of your photograph, does it transcend beyond the borders of China, the man and the tank?
I think it's universal if they understand what happened. A lot of students think there's a parade going on, or they haven't seen the photo and they're not sure what's going on. And it really is a wide gap going on right now. There's a lot of folks from older generations that immediately recognize the picture, and there's a lot of younger people that can relate and understand that photo. I did a talk at Ohio University not too long ago, and at the end of my talk, a Chinese woman came up to me, a student, Chinese student, and she said, "Mr. Widener, I just want to thank you for showing me this, because I never knew this happened in my country."
Right, that's fascinating. Jeff Widener, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's bring in our panel now. Chinese dissident Wei Kai-shi was one of the student leaders during the Tiananmen Square demonstrations. He joins us from London. In Beijing, we have China affairs analyst Xu Qinduo, and Qinghua Fu is an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong's Journalism and Media Studies Center. He joins us now from Boston. Xu, I had a different question lined up for you initially, but after what I heard from Jeff, I want to pose that to you. He said that young Chinese people coming up to him and saying, "I didn't even know this happened in my country," which is testament to the fact that China has covered this up. It's erased the history of what happened at Tiananmen. Isn't that an embarrassment to the country?
Obviously, this event was not taught in the Chinese history textbooks. I would say most of the young people, I would say they are aware of the incident. Probably there are individuals who have never heard of that or who have never seen that picture. I wouldn't be surprised. But again, if say the Chinese government is trying to cover this incident, but I think it's politically, culturally, the Chinese stress very much about harmony rather than discord, stress very much about the unity rather than confrontation or division. So that's a culture. And also, people like to remember, something positive, what happened in the past, instead of something tragedy, probably. I think it has something to do with that.
Okay, but we also hear about the rape of Nanking and other things. So I don't know how that squares. What does the Chinese government fear by letting their people know what happened 30 years ago?
Oh, I don't think the Chinese government fears anything in terms of the country's development. Look, I think there are a lot of priorities, current priority facing the Chinese government. For example, the creation of jobs, the looming trade war looming large with the United States, and also how to manage the economy to continue to grow. So people have the jobs, people continue to have the living standard improved. That's a more challenging situation, more challenging jobs for Chinese leadership, rather than, say, spending time probably to talk more about what happened 30 years ago, I guess.
Wei Kai-shi, you were there 30 years ago. You're clearly not in China at the moment. Firstly, tell us why you're in London and whether or what it would be like if you tried to go back to China. And secondly, address Xu Qinduo's point that, well, the focus is on harmony and there are other priorities for China right now. They don't want to talk about Tiananmen.
Thank you very much for having me here. Yes, I'm here in London premiering a film about Liu Xiaobo and going to Oxford Union to take part in a panel to talk about Tiananmen. The fact China banned words about Tiananmen, about June 4th, is undeniable. It's not culture, it's propaganda. In our culture, in the culture of Chinese 5,000 years of history, 4,000 years of history, cover up was never part of the Chinese culture. Let's not use the word culture just to alienate China from the rest of the world. We are all the same. We want to hear the truth. We want our freedom. It's not like, okay, we have a priority to get our stomach filled so that we don't care about our freedom. That, if you call it the Chinese culture, I think 1 billion people, if you give them an opportunity to speak up, they will dispute that very much. And then in 1989, we did dispute that. In the decade of 1980s, Chinese situation was getting better. Yes, because it was in such a low point at the end of the 70s in the Cultural Revolution. So in the 80s, any of the reform and then opening up, that's the slogan of the Deng Xiaoping introduced at that time, yes, brought prosperity and hope for China. At that time, when people were thinking, tomorrow is going to be better than today, and today was already better than yesterday. So that has been, Chinese people's demand for more and more open up. And yet, at the same time, every single year during the 80s, there were student demonstrations. I think that is also an undeniable fact. Those student demonstrations was against Chinese government's propaganda on, let's us just feed you. Be quiet about political opinions. So the country is trying to tell us, if we can feed you, then you should be shut up. It's like a pig farming culture. That is certainly not a culture of Chinese. That will be an insult to the concept of Chinese culture.
When I did an internet search and I went onto Wikipedia, you featured in the Wikipedia entry on Tiananmen. You were one of the top names there. Can you go back? Would something happen to you if you actually went back home?
Well, I'm still most wanted by the Chinese government's, definition, and by the word most wanted, it is supposed to want me, and I turned myself back to the Chinese regime 4 times through different channels, and then all rejected.
Why?
They wouldn't let me turn myself in because, the Chinese government is afraid of dialogue.
That's
you know what? In Chinese culture, back in Tang Dynasty or Han Dynasty, government never refused dialogue. So again, refusing dialogue is not a culture thing.
Okay, I want to bring in King. Okay, I want to bring in King Wafu. King Wafu, you want to come in?
First, I would wish to comment on the priority issue first. So, my take is that Chinese Communist Party basically has long history of making worse mistakes, including Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward. So all of these, like Tiananmen Square crackdown, are still politically sensitive in China up to now. So the party doesn't want to really face the history and really learn from the mistakes. So because the reflection itself is a threat to the state stability, and of course also a threat to the leaders' best interests. So from this perspective, it's not really surprising to me that the party continue to suppress public discussion on Tiananmen Square crackdown.
Are they discussing it though, King Wafu? Because as far as I understand, you've been able to tap into some of the conversation that's been banned within the borders of China. Give us some insight into that.
Okay, correct. Even after 30 years, basically Tiananmen Square crackdown is still a political sensitive issue. This is what we know. The authority continuously suppress activity and the public speech. But on the social media, we found evidence that many posts that were made by the Chinese netizen in different forms to commemorate the June 4th, including making a candlelight photo, creating emojis, posting a variety form of a Jeff Tangman picture. That's back to the question, talk about the symbolism. There's a lot of different, we found more than 24 different variety of Tangman pictures circulating on social media, including writing a poem. This is people using different form to discuss about the issue. Even though all of these were eventually censored, but they managed to survive in the public domain for, say, a few hours' time. But that already generates a certain extent of impact. This is a very strong evidence that the event is not forgotten by the Chinese people.
Xu Qinduo, it's not forgotten by the Chinese people, so why doesn't the government tap into that? Because maybe there'll be an opportunity for healing then.
See, the government has learned, from the government perspective, I guess they would love to, handle the event differently in terms of how to handle such a kind of issue, like, Occupy Wall Street, like a yellow vest movement in the Paris. It's really about the technical issue in a sense. It plays an important role. And secondly, I think the government has learned a lesson from this tragedy. That is, stability is a priority. Without stability, there's no development. If you look at the past 40 years, if you look at the great achievement, China is now from a poor country to the second largest economy. I don't agree with the attitudes to dismiss the
But that was based on the government's own definition of the people being counter-revolutionaries, right? Who's to say that the country couldn't have been still stable, but China would not have massacred those people on the streets? I mean, ultimately, what you're saying is that 30 years down the road, they're looking at it as saying, this is a lesson that we should never, ever allow any form of democracy ever again because we don't want to deal with it. Is that
no? If you look at the Chinese people compared to 30 years ago, obviously the people with the spread of social media, the people have obviously more freedom. I mean, in terms of where you live, in terms of finding a job, etc. If you look at the people's attitudes towards, say, approval rate of the government done by Ipsos, I think that's a yearly survey. For example, like 86-87% of the public, they are supportive of the government. They think their country is on the right track to the future. And if you look back in 1989, I just talked to a few students actually, participated in the event. At the very beginning, there's this activity they call the profiteering or speculation. People are not happy with that. They call it in Chinese word 官导导业. So people, stood up and took to the streets. I think that's right. That they're right. And also some students, also think why my professor is making less money than, say, a barber in the barber shop. They think there's a lack of fairness in society. So that's the very beginning. Gradually now, people call it like, people are asking, or we're asking democracy and freedom. So it's a gradual development. It lasted for almost 2 months. So that's a situation, with the chaos.
And
how
then
can deal with that?
But then it was crushed, right? I mean, there's no evidence that they had any weapons. There's no evidence that they did any harm towards the police or the army initially. Let's ask. You said you were speaking to some of the students. Okay,
that's what I said.
Okay,
that's what I said. They could have done it much better in a better way.
Okay, so let's ask somebody who was there. Where Kai-shi, you could have done it much better and prevented it. Go ahead.
Well, Professor Xu, I think I got your name there. You talked about approval rate. That's very interesting. Approval rate of Chinese people to the Chinese government. It doesn't make any sense in a country that does not have free flow of information to talk about approval rate. Well, if you want to talk about it, you know what? North Korea has a much higher approval rate of the leadership.
No,
you think North Korea?
You are wrong. It's done by Ipsos, the French company. It's not done by the Chinese government.
But no, I'm not saying it's Chinese. I'm talking about Chinese society that does not allow free flow of information. Are you going to argue about that?
I would argue freedom has its limit. In different societies, probably people see it differently. And also, you have to respect every country have their sovereign right. They manage their economy. They manage their society.
You don't deserve a right
if they do a good job, people are happy with that. If they done a bad job, people are not happy.
North Korea are not happy.
I think
you think so?
That's clear. Sorry?
You think North Korean people are happier?
Well, I've never been there. I have no idea whether they are happy or not.
You have to agree with them to support your
judge upon North Korea. I wouldn't be that crazy to compare China to North Korea.
Well, one thing that's comparable is that both countries control information flow. You're not going to deny that, are you?
Well, in terms of control information flow, do you think there's absolute freedom in London, in Washington?
Okay,
so there's no whatever control for information.
What is the percentage of freedom you think is appropriate?
No,
don't use the word absolute to deny like a general
it's
freedom.
It's easier to talk about in the abstract sense, talk about democracy, freedom. Of course, it's good, but put them into reality. It's a long process, and it's often.
Okay, so let me jump in here. Shoot. Okay.
You deserve
hold on, gentlemen. Just give me a second here. Just give me a second here, because Xu Qin was saying that it's a process, right? Let me bring in somebody who's actually protesting right now, an activist who says, well, that process hasn't borne any fruits. Have a little listen to this.
The students back then were opposing corruption, but now things are more serious than in 1989. There is now the abuse of power, destruction of churches, Buddhist statues, and it seems to be going back towards the Cultural Revolution.
That was Chu Yuming. So, Xu Qingduo, where's the evidence where's the evidence that China has been opening up gradually towards democracy when 30 years on we can't even talk about Tiananmen?
Yes, I have the evidence. If you bother to check the number of the people who have religious practice in China, it's 10 times, maybe 11 times than 30 years ago. That's the progress. That's a hard evidence of progress. If there's a problem, of course, in any country there's a problem. If there's, the people you interviewed mentioned about, say, so-called crackdown on the religion, for example, it only happened in Zhejiang province, in one of the cities of Zhejiang province. They have their clear regulation. Okay. If there are some violation of the regulation, then there's a problem. Okay. There's a confrontation.
I want to bring in King Hua-Fu.
The government and the local.
Okay, let's go to Hong Kong. King Hua-Fu, come in.
May I say a few words about the approval rate, basically, because in the academia, basically, we are pretty skeptical to the opinion poll in the authoritarian country, because the people usually have the fear to really speak about their real opinion through using the telephone interview. So that is one thing I think people need to bear in mind. Second point is, if you, I don't have the figures how many people are attending church and religion in China, but we can find increasingly more missionary or people participating in church, Falun Gong, people get arrested and detained in China. So I don't see really, we can see one single figure, so you can see really China is really opening up.
Okay, Wei Kai-shih, my final question to you, big picture. Beyond Tiananmen, I know Tiananmen's usually considered one of the 3 T's, Tiananmen, Tibet, Taiwan, the three things you don't talk about. Let us add Xinjiang and the issue of the Uyghurs and possible concentration camps over there. Big picture, tell me how you see China right now in the year 2019 when it comes to the freedom of the human beings within its borders.
30 years ago, Chinese government took a drastic turn from opening and reform, with its bloody, brutal massacre to the peaceful petitioners in Tiananmen Square, and then to 30 years of the change in that direction. Today, China is one of the worst totalitarian regime that kills freedoms, that eliminates religious freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. All those people who challenge on those fronts get arrested. Even those just people who have the identity of being an Uyghur, just it's something they were born with. They cannot do anything about it. They are put into a concentration camp. China today is one of the worst source of the global harmony, universal value. And then it's a threat to the modern days civilization. And for that, I think I blame mostly, of course, to Chinese regime, but also the Western democracies, the so-called, and then global citizens today under stress also take a piece of blame and then a piece of responsibility to restore China to the civilized, opening up reform direction.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Wei Kai-shih, Xu Qingduo, and King Hua-Fu. Thanks for joining us. Still ahead on the program, Muhammadu Buhari begins his 2nd term as Nigeria's president. But is he the leader the people want? And is he up to the task? And is this media monitoring organization fighting anti-Semitism or contributing to Islamophobia?
I'm very, very disappointed, especially Nigerian youth. You can see the whole country, the whole system is not working.
A stadium packed with dignitaries provided a ceremonious welcome to Muhammadu Buhari before he was sworn in for his 2nd term on Wednesday. But not everyone is so reverential. With the economy struggling, unemployment skyrocketing, and over 100 Chibok girls missing since 2014, Buhari does not exactly tick all the boxes for a popular leader. So, how did he win 56% of the vote in February's election? The opposition argues Buhari cheated, and it's challenging the results in court. Well, joining me now to discuss this from London is Kayode Ogundamisi. He was a member of Buhari's 2019 presidential campaign for the ruling All Progressives Congress Party. And in Dubai is the spokesman for the opposition leader Atiku Abubakar's presidential campaign, Segun Showunmi. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Segun, nobody else is making a big noise about this. They seem to accept that Buhari has won. Is this a bit desperate from your side, from Atiku's side, challenging the results?
Everybody is making what you call the calm before the storm. Nigerians generally are shocked. The level of shock that has hit them is such that they never imagined that they were going to come a day in the country where an election will resemble the feasting and the balkanization of the country, including the criminality that has produced the results. We are only following the dictates and the attitude of His Excellency Atiku Abubakar, who is a Democrat through and through. And in Atiku's case, Atiku prefers that things are done in a methodological, orderly manner, given that the laws allows us to go to court, which we have gone, and it allows us to file our petition and bring our case before the court, which we have done. But nobody, not even the Buhari government, should ever mistake that we're going about things methodologically and peacefully to mean that maybe we've accepted or we're going to be cowed or we're going to abandon the prosecution of our case. What we hope will happen is that very soon the case will open up and Nigerians will begin to see how this whole mess that we have gotten ourselves has happened. And you would have noticed that most of the big players in the country, most of the former leaders of our country who normally will grace a swearing in with their presence, all of them have stayed away. The president himself could not even bring himself to make a speech at his own declaration. It is indicative of the fact that he knows that that mandate is stolen, he doesn't have a right to be there, and he's there illegitimately.
Kayode, people from the outside looking in, trying to wonder how, if all the indicators of Buhari's first term suggest that things haven't improved, corruption's still bad, poverty and unemployment still bad, the country's still insecure. With all of that in mind, why would 56% of Nigerians choose to give this man another term? Would you agree that maybe that's a little bit mysterious?
Well, if that is mysterious, then we have to cancel all the votes given to the opposition candidate Atiku Abubakar. If he's saying the election was rigged, then that means all the millions of votes accredited to him are not real. But look, the country has moved forward. This is before a competent court of law, the laws of the land. The court is going to determine the viability of the election. And whatever frustration, whatever angry adjective being used by the opposition candidate Atiku Abubakar is just an opinion. It's in court. The current president, Muhammadu Buhari, was in court 3 times when he felt aggrieved, and the court gave judgment that the PDP won the election. He moved on. He kept contesting, and today is a 2-time elected president of the country. I think the opposition, we advised them during the election that they should spend more time with the nooks and crannies of the Nigerian electorate, but they were busy aligning with people who wanted to divide the country. They were busy spreading fake news. But we've moved on. We can consider things are not the way it should be, but things are getting better.
Segun, if the appellate court comes back and says the election stands, Buhari did win, would you accept that?
If the appellate court, since it's not a final court in this matter, we will take the matter straight to the Supreme Court. And when we go to the Supreme Court, and if for any reason the Supreme Court rules against us, we will just know that the entire Nigerian citizenry has been shortchanged. Sometimes people can be powerless in the face of draconian measures that have been put in place to suppress them. But the worst thing that can happen to anybody or to Nigeria,
you can't even subject yourself to the rule of law.
It's for those who feel aggrieved. It's for those who feel aggrieved not to be able to exercise the right within the franchise that's available within the law. And far from being angry, the comments and adjectives that we have used have always been those that are measured. Some of us are not going to go into a revisionist agenda, but we recall the kinds of adjectives that General Buhari usually used every time he was in court. If he wasn't, trying to implode the country, he was making statements that could lead to violence. You would have noticed that Atiku Abubakar has calmed the frayed nerves of his supporters, and in any case, he has just followed the process of the law.
Okay, let me get a response
all we
from
are saying
Kayode.
to them is that no amount of harassment, no amount of intimidation is going to allow us to abandon the case.
Kayode?
You can see appropriating and reappropriating. You were asked, you asked him, would you respect the decision of the Supreme Court? And he's now sort of impugning on the integrity of the Nigerian judiciary. These are the kind of characters, rhetorics the Nigerian electorate witnessed and decided to just dump them in the history books. You cannot eat your cake and keep it. You cannot eat it and have it. It's either you respect the laws of the land. If the laws of the land says Buhari was not duly elected, Buhari would go back to his village in Daura. He's not above the country. I don't see any reason why if the Supreme Court decide that Atiku has no case, the Atiku camp will now be saying Nigeria is not a country that should be accepted. Look, if you want to become the president and commander-in-chief of a country, you subject yourself to the rule of law.
Let me ask you something.
And if you display those comments...
Okay, just moving away from the dispute over the election, I just want to ask you about the failures over the past few years, because you would agree, as I mentioned, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Nigeria in the same place as it was before, 144th. The Minister of Labour and Employment, Chris Ngige, Senator, said that unemployment will reach 33.5% by 2020. That's next year. Terrible. Corruption, unemployment, poverty, insecurity. Boko Haram has splintered, so it's become worse. So even though Buhari's been sworn in for another term, would you accept, Kayode, that Buhari's made a bit of a mess of his first term?
We would concede to the fact that Buhari has not, the country concedes to the fact that the Buhari government has not fulfilled all his electoral promises. But the country would also concede, as it's been renewed in a mandate, that some areas of governance has improved in terms of infrastructure. The Boko Haram crisis you're talking about, we are not happy with where we are, but we are happy we moved away from where it was when the former administration were there. And we are quite hopeful that moving forward with this second time, the government will be able to increase its security architecture to limit Boko Haram and actually disengage them. Before now, you couldn't be in Abuja and some cities, they were being blown up, the United Nations Center. But it's not a government that is in denial. There are challenges, and those challenges are being addressed, and they will be addressed.
Shegun, final answer from you.
We have to always remind ourselves that one of the things that democracy affords countries and citizens is to take a position, as it were, on a referendum on the performance of the incumbent. It has never happened, and this is also an aberration, that on all the key indicators for performance and measurement, the incumbent failed and failed woefully. And you come to the Nigerian space and say that the Nigerians now honored them with more opportunities to make their life much more miserable. They failed the first time. We are not hopeful of whatever they can do now. We're just pleading and hoping that when all is done and dusted, the Nigerian people will have the kind of leader that has a conceptual framework, that the vision can carry Nigeria out of this mess. I have looked at all the thematic headings. I try to see where I can give them a bit of a score, but on all material indicators, they scored 0. They didn't do well in human capital development. They didn't do well with healthcare. Their candidate even runs up and down other countries for his own health. They didn't do well with social stabilization. They didn't do well on security. They didn't do well on national cohesion. They didn't do well on power infrastructure. They didn't do well on anti-corruption. It was just a farce and a charade. I ask, by what magic do normal people vote in a government that has not done well? In any case, unlike what my friend Kade is saying, I didn't say we will not respect the decision of the courts. No, I said we will take it to the ultimate, which is the Supreme Court. And thereafter, we will then see how the things are called out. We are Democrats. Atiku Abubakar is a sure-footed Democrat of very long-standing history, and we do not intend to depart from that. We will just say Nigerians should tarry a while. They should keep faith with the candidacy and with the agenda and the hope and the vision we bring. And by the grace of God, we believe when we get our mandate back, Nigeria will move very, very quickly in all the right direction under any proper leadership.
Segun Showunmi and Kayode Ogundamisi, I thank you both for taking the time to talk to us. It's often used as a source by mainstream newspapers and TV channels. The Middle East Media Research Institute, abbreviated to MEMRI, translates media from the Muslim world into English. Describing itself as non-partisan, MEMRI says it exposes anti-Semitism, monitors terrorist groups, and gives a platform to Arab reformers. But is this a case of selective memory? Here's a look of what they do.
جاء عيسى عليه الصلاة والسلام يقول لهم اتركوا أموالكم واتبعوني. ما ينفعش. هذا الموضوع مش نافع.
انتم متصورين انتم يا الشباب المايع التافه هذا متصورين انكم بهذه الطريقة تتحضرون يعني؟ انه انتم تصيرون نفس الشباب الغربي التالف اللي يتأنث ويتخنث؟ من واجبنا من واجب المجتمع المؤمن القضاء على هذه الظاهرة ولكن بأي شيء بالوسائل المشروعة.
Critics say the institute cherry-picks stories in the media that portray Muslims as hateful and ignorant. Its assertion of being independent and unbiased has also been questioned. MEMRI was founded by a former Israeli military intelligence officer, and its board features former Israeli ministers. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Berkeley, California by Hatem Bazian. He's a professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College. And in London, we have Middle East media analyst Tom Gross. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Tom Gross, is MEMRI a propaganda outfit or does it provide a valuable service?
No, I think it's very unfair to call it a propaganda outfit. Look, it adds to the mix. It's obviously filling in the gaps that it feels are not being covered elsewhere. Many media journalists in the West, they don't speak Arabic, they don't have the resources to examine media. But although MEMRI also does highlight although MEMRI does highlight aspects of conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitism, it also highlights a lot of calls for reform in the wider Middle East and Arab reformers and liberals. So it's not only highlighting negative stuff, it's also highlighting positive elements of Arab media.
Hatem, are you convinced?
Not by the least. I think MEMRI has to be understood as being part of an Israeli front, part of the Hasbara network. This is to explain, to inform. It bills itself as bridging the language gap between the Middle East and the West. And I actually say it builds the bridge to the Islamophobic horizon in the West and continues to stoke Islamophobic imagery in the American Western civil society. It cherry picks the information. It actually, its translation, while sometimes accurate, it actually tries to fill the gaps to try to constantly present the Muslims and the Arab world as being anything but part of the world. It is a strategy to maintain the American public and the United States government solidly and conditionally supportive of Israel. And therefore, it has to be understood that MEMRI is a propaganda front for Israeli political speak and nothing more, nothing less.
Hatem, is there a deeper, more uncomfortable reality here that yes, even though they might be cherry picking, yes, even though they might have an agenda, there is just a plethora of this stuff available from which they can choose sectarianism from, I don't know, Iraqi Shia channels or Iranian channels saying stuff about Sunnis, sectarianism from Sunnis saying terrible stuff about Shias, anti-Semitic stuff. It's all there. and it's making MEMRI's job very easy for them?
Well, one can say there's definitely lots of material in there, but one has to step back and not to think of MEMRI and its board of directors and those individuals that are involved in it are somewhat disconnected from what is occurring in the Arab and Muslim world. One cannot speak of Iraq without actually thinking of that pre the invasion of Iraq, which many of those who are on MEMRI's board, including Bolton, Wormser, and others, were pushing for the Iraq war. And then after that, they say, you see, the Sunnis and Shias hate each other.
Okay, that's
So
an interesting point. Certainly, I want to pose that to Tom Gross, right? So when we look at MEMRI's own board of directors, or the board of advisors, rather, it includes John Bolton, James Woolsey. I've had some conversations with the former CIA director, Woolsey, who's very keen on war with Iran. John Ashcroft, the former Attorney General. Donald Rumsfeld, we all know Rumsfeld's record. Alan Dershowitz, Ehud Barak, and so on. It was founded also by someone who served as an advisor to two Israeli prime ministers. With that in mind, they have an agenda. Would you accept that, Tom?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to point out, I checked just before this interview, a lot of the staff of MEMRI are not Israeli or American. The staff of MEMRI include Palestinians, Saudi Arabians, Sudanese, Indian Muslims in New Delhi, covering Pakistan with Urdu and so on. Also, MEMRI is actually technically an American organization. It's not an Israeli organization. But I think the point is that we shouldn't be discussing MEMRI. We should be discussing the anti-Semitism and other conspiracy stuff that unfortunately is prevalent in a lot of Middle East media, which is a problem mainly for those own societies. I mean, I'm sure we all agree that we'd like to see a more liberal, better Middle East, and it's not helpful with this kind of conspiratorial broadcast.
But Tom, are we seeing MEMRI offering us up some Jerry Springer show variety of options here? That's not all we've got in the Middle East, but MEMRI is giving us a very skewed version of reality there.
I don't think so. I did a search under this on their website, and there's something called the MEMRI, the Middle East Reformists Project. There are dozens and dozens of clips they've highlighted, which are very good, which show all kinds of reformists' voices, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's rights for women, minorities, homosexuals, against domestic violence, and so on. Of course, I'm not suggesting there are not these kinds of problems in the West and all around the world too. It's not just in the Middle East, for sure. But certainly a lot of Arab and wider Middle Eastern reformers welcome the work of MEMRI. So of course, they're not trying to cover everything. They are what I would call filling in the gaps. There are plenty of other media out there and other academic and media sources for people to get information from. But I would say that MEMRI do play an important role. And as we witnessed recently with the Holocaust distortion piece on Al Jazeera themselves then disciplined the two journalists involved and apologized. So Al Jazeera, in effect, thanked MEMRI for pointing out something that they didn't think was good.
Although MEMRI did the translation afterwards, I think it was initially translated by somebody else, right? But let me take that point, Hatem. So with AJ Plus, they had one message in English and one message in Arabic, and people put these together and showed a discrepancy and said, hey, there's anti-Semitism in this AJ Plus Arabic video, and it enacted change. Tom's point is that exposing this stuff leads to change. Would you disagree with that?
I'm not in disagreement that some cases that change has to take place and people need to take responsibility. But to assume at the core that MEMRI is neutral and it's researching for the best interest of the Arab and Muslim world, it's a smack of insult, almost compounded insult on this case. Had they been neutral, I would ask them, where is the reform messages for the Palestinians and those that are rotting in Israeli jails? Where are the critique of Netanyahu, who hugs almost every other neo-fascist that are taking place in Europe? Where is their critique of the French Marine Le Pen? Where is their critique of the rising tide of right wing? To assume that they're sitting in there and just being neutrally trying to assess anti-Semitism, I would say that has to be challenged. MEMRI basically is a propaganda machine that stokes and promotes Islamophobic discourse by trying to highlight and constantly present the Muslims as an individual that does not belong to civilization, that does not have the capacity for liberalism. And I think that's what memory has to be critiqued and take responsibility.
Okay, and I'm going to get Tom to respond to that in a second. But let me give you one example, Hatem. Going through MEMRI's archives, seeing Saudi reformist voices speaking out against the kingdom. Would you have any problem with that? I saw that on MEMRI, people talking about the situation in Saudi Arabia, and these are reformist Saudi voices. They're not there to make Arabs or Muslims look bad.
Oh, that's a great question. I would ask MEMRI possibly to check with John Bolton and his relationship with Saudi Arabia, rather than actually beat up the Muslims and say, you see, you are uncivilized and unable to support your human rights activists.
But they're not necessarily making that argument, right? They're putting the clip up there, and you can decide if these people are uncivilized or not, right? Yeah.
But again, this is a responsibility of actually who is responsible. If you want to paint in a broad brush to say that the Muslim world is full of anti-Semitism, in essence to say that is the reason for opposition to Israel, then MEMRI is your go-to site.
Tom Gross, I think Hatem would be happier if MEMRI also featured some crazy kahanists who say terrible things about Palestinians, which is obviously out there, but you have to work harder to find it because MEMRI doesn't show it.
Well, first of all, I just want to correct a few things. I've only ever met once someone connected to MEMRI at a conference in Washington 2 years ago. And at the time, he was the vice president. And he is born in Cuba, came to America when he's 1. He's the former American ambassador to Sudan, a fluent Arab speaker. He is not somebody, he has nothing to do with Israel. He's a practicing Roman Catholic. So first of all, it's wrong to suggest this is some kind of neocon John Bolton type front. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, I don't think it pretends to be neutral, to use your word. In fact, I don't know any media that's entirely neutral. It is not neutral between, let's say, Islamists and reformers in the Arab world. It's not trying to be, okay? It's filling a gap which it feels is not being filled in certain other parts of the media. So it's not pretending to cover everything. Vis-a-vis Israel, thankfully in Israel, as far as I'm aware, there's a very robust media. You have papers like the most serious intellectual paper of Israel, Haaretz, which has a lot of articles very critical of their own army and their own government and so on in Haaretz and elsewhere. So it's not that they're not, there's plenty of places one can find criticism of Israel, whether warranted or exaggerated or not warranted. So I don't think MEMRI is trying to be the entire world media and, let's say, criticize Le Pen that you mentioned in France and so on. As far as I'm aware, although I've never met him, the founder of MEMRI, who is Israeli, worked for Yitzhak Rabin, who, as you know, was the assassinated former prime minister on the center-left Labour Party. So he's not, as far as I'm aware, some kind of hardline right-wing Israeli. And I think that MEMRI is filling a gap. And I think the real question is, why don't we talk about this segment, instead of talking about the messenger, MEMRI, why aren't we talking about why there isn't a freer media in Arab countries and so on? It would be, I think,
but we do, certainly on this program we do, and we've had that conversation, and we'll continue to have that conversation. This was a good bit of insight into MEMRI because people talk about it, and we decided to shed a light on it. We invited MEMRI onto the program. They didn't get back to us, unfortunately. Maybe we'll talk to them a little bit later on down the line. But gentlemen, I've got to move on. I really thank you both for joining us, Tom Gross and Hatem Bazian. Thanks for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Goodbye.